Hello and welcome to this very quick video on the first section of Autonomy and Theory, Pros and Cons. Due to time constraints, I thought I'd record a video of me talking through some of the key points, possible links, implications, arguments, examples, etc. of this first section, so we can then move straight away on to part 2. So, first of all then, part 1 is for Schneewind a continuation of the journey toward autonomy. And the reason that I'm able to do this as a video as opposed to in person is because the key parts are two theories that we have studied in detail before, namely UT and intuitionism. It's basically about how do you make decisions. We need to look at, I think, as I go through the presentation, scholars involved, strengths and weaknesses, and how do UT and intuitionism differ. Okay, there are 4 paragraphs in this section. However, I think that they can be split into 2 subsections. The first 2 paragraphs on UT and the second 2 paragraphs on intuitionism. So the first section then. There are lots of different subpoints drawn into these four key points, and the idea is, the overall theme is that autonomy comes from working decisions out for yourself, what the overall happiness is. So, first key point then, in the first part of the first paragraph, is that Bentham saw his UT as similar to common sense morality in terms of the outcome, yet it seemed, according to Schneewind at least, to be based on complex calculations like the hedonic calculus. The second key point, which is in the first paragraph, then talks about and goes on to talk about John Stuart Mill. Now, John Stuart Mill, as we know, develops on Bentham's UT, and he says that we have this common sense morality. Perhaps it's more simplistic than Bentham's in terms of, for example, human rights and liberty, but he says we then use this principle of utility on top of this common sense morality as a guide. The third key point in the UT part then is in the second paragraph, top of the second paragraph, and it talks about Bentham and Mill both holding a consequential view of right and good. And it talks about the idea that they both believe that what is right is based on the outcome. So whatever causes a good outcome must be right. And they're both based on versions of either happiness or pleasure. And the final point in the UT section, bottom of the second paragraph, is that UT says that whatever people want is good. However, intuitionists disagree. I'll now go through, I think, some of the things that popped into my head as I was annotating the anthology. Use this only as a guide, a springboard for your own annotations in terms of examples and implications. So the first point then about Bentham seeing his UT as similar to common sense and yet based on complex calculations. Now that second part, that complex calculations seemed to be based on complex calculations, is an argument directly by Schneewind. So that's Schneewind endorsing a criticism of the hedonic calculus. So that's the first link I would make. It links to Bentham saying the hedonic calculus is the best way of making moral decisions. However, the paragraph itself says that perhaps ordinary people can't access this hedonic calculus in everyday situations. And an example to use with that is Philippa Foot's trolleyology dilemma, where you have 5 people on one track and 1 person on the other, and you have to decide who to save. Actually, using the hedonic calculus in such an ethical situation perhaps would take too long or would be confusing and is contrary to what common sense could achieve. So whilst Bentham saw his common sense as similar to UT in terms of rational outcome, you could argue that it's too complex and therefore different to common sense. You could also argue that actually Bentham's UT is very similar to common sense, and go back to Philippa Foot's trolleyology dilemma. It's what a lot of children, at least the students that I teach around year 9 when I use this dilemma, they actually see common sense as this. When talking about Bentham's UT in general, you can bring in problems with the approach of greatest happiness for the greatest number. You can talk, for example, about the sadistic guards getting lots of pleasure out of a misery of torturing an individual. You can talk about tyranny of the majority, the fact that UT sees the majority of people's pleasure as greater than the minority, and this can result in, for example, 49% of people being unhappy for the sake of 51% of people being happy. The idea is, of course, that is this common sense morality? Is this fully autonomous? In terms of implications for religion, well, we know that Bentham's theory is an attempt at equality. Everyone counts for one, he says, but nobody for more than one. And for that reason, that egalitarian nature of his theory, there's no place for religion. It's a non-theistic theory. The question then, in terms of implications, is what would society be like? There's no place for religion, so it puts religion out of the equation. Well, what would society be like if it was run in this utilitarian sort of way? That's something to discuss in the implications section. Individual decisions may become difficult, and you can talk about it being perhaps cold and emotionless. Then in terms of the second half of this first paragraph, we look at John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill says we have this common sense morality, and we use it as a principle, and we use the principle of utility as a guide. Now, the principle of utility can link to aggregate individual happiness, and we have this idea of common sense of differentiating between different types of pleasure, as Mill puts it, his higher and lower pleasures. He developed on Bentham's idea, taking this idea of being governed by two sovereign masters, pleasure and pain, which is what Bentham said, moving on from that, and actually saying that we should include certain, I guess, common sense rights, including liberty and human rights. You can talk about the strengths of higher and lower pleasures and of human rights. You can say that human rights and liberty mean for a less cold and emotionless society, a society with, as we would say, more humanity. Still has this sense of feeling, but it's a non-theistic approach still, so the implication for religion would be fairly drastic if this was the case. The second 2 points then. In the second paragraph, it amalgamates the discussion between Bentham and Mill and what they share. Now it talks about being consequential and this idea of the good outcome, going back to what is right first. So what is right is whatever leads to good. And in this case, it's about happiness or pleasure. Now you can talk about Bentham being teleological, and I mentioned the two sovereign masters quote. You can draw it back to Epicurus, who talks about ethical egoism or hedonism, and whatever causes pleasure is good, whatever causes pain is bad, and this implication of us all being pleasure seekers and pain avoiders. In this part, it's fairly relevant to discuss the differences between Bentham and Mill. They do both, however, decide what is right based on whatever the outcome is. So to disagree with that, you can use Kant, of course, and certainly, and more relevantly here, I think you can use David Hume, who disagrees with the idea that whatever is, as it says earlier, in fact, in Schneewind, in the previous section, in the Toward Autonomy section, Hume says reason is and ought to be the slave of passion. So we do not work out what is right by whatever causes good. We work out what is right through feeling, through emotion, and that disagrees with this idea of Bentham and Mill and teleology. Another question you could pose is, if pleasure is good, how do we then define good? Which is, you could argue, from a meta-ethics perspective, something that both Bentham and Mill neglect. The final point then is that UT says that whatever people want is good, but intuitionists disagree. W.D. Ross, who develops on G.E. Moore's intuitionism, more on that later, says that there are prima facie duties, self-evident principles, and there's no need for working them out. So in terms of linking that in here, intuitionists, like W.D. Ross, disagree that whatever people want is good. Actually, he said that whatever people want doesn't necessarily have to be good. It must align with our intuitions. So this is the first point where you can compare and contrast UT. Another question is, given that this is autonomy, I'm talking about moving towards autonomy, is working out our happiness really free? What is the more autonomous position here? That we're guided by our own intuition? Or I should say guided by intuition? Or is it that we are guided by rationality to work out the happiness for the majority, or the least suffering for the majority? You can also start to talk about examples and further implications. The second section then, intuitionism, I've called it, and that's the second 2 paragraphs. How it links here is it disagreed with working out what is good, and says that our autonomy, as I said previously, comes from knowing what morality is, and therefore what moral acts require. Okay, the first 2 points are in the first paragraph, the second 2 points are in the second paragraph. I've also mentioned some of the scholars here that link in. So first of all, we've got William Whewell, who's a Christian intuitionist, argues against this UT idea, that individuals can know how to act through working it out. Rather, he says that individuals can know how to act and they're guided by internal moral principles. And this is versus the UT scholar Henry Sidgwick, who says that intuitionism is not practical on its own, but does need UT to make decisions. So a first sort of revisionist UT scholar, Henry Sidgwick, who attempts to reconcile intuitionism and UT. The second key point in the first paragraph is this phrase, feeling guides us to a realm of real values, objective values that guide us. And that was Max Scheler who said that, and Franz Brentano. These are 2 of the scholars mentioned by Schneewind. The third key point then, and this is now in the final paragraph of the section, is G.E. Moore, who will be familiar with from studying ethical language, and also he talks about ideal UT. And this part talks about G.E. Moore referencing us having a knowledge of good and bad, but that knowledge cannot be derived from the study of facts. It must come, it says, from within ourselves and guide us to knowledge of right acts. And the fourth and final point is an objection, but despite all of this, intuitionism offers us no way of solving moral disputes. Okay, William Whewell then, the first intuitionist scholar, Christian scholar, against this UT idea. He's defending Christianity here against the non-theistic onslaught of the popularized UT. And he is in contrast to Henry Sidgwick, who actually defends intuitionism and UT. Intuitionism is not practical, but UT can help it, in conjunction, can make moral decisions. And the first question is, This idea that that intuitionism isn't practical and it needs UT to make decisions, well, you ask the deeper question, does morality need to have a point? Do we need to make decisions practically in society, or can we just feel what is right? What are the implications of that idea of not even working something out, but just having this everyday feeling and acting upon it? That can be linked to Jameson, and in Jameson's anthology he talks about the idea that moral theory actually stems from everyday actions taking place. So people don't think about what they're doing first, they just do it. And that supports Whewell's idea of intuitionism, the fact that it doesn't need to be practical. Whewell says that we do need to think deeper about morals, that's this section here. And he says that it needs to be more than just this UT idea of pleasure. Well, actually, you could argue UT is a bit more than just pleasure and pain. However, he says that there's actually a place for God within intuitionism. Perhaps you could link it to Cardinal Newman's voice of God within. The further question is, then, can each individual know what morality requires? Whewell says that we can. We have our own intuition. However, does that align with Christian doctrine and Christian teachings? What are the implications there for Scripture? Perhaps it's impractical. Do we need to appeal to Scripture for guidance? And if we don't, then what's the point of religious Scripture, or of priests, or of the Church? UT, for Sidgwick, is the practical part of moral decision making. And you can go back to all of your previous arguments and talk about UT versus intuitionism again. You could talk about this idea of, for example, whose intuition is right, and you can say, well, if Ian Huntley's intuition is to kill a schoolgirl, who are we to say that he's wrong? So this idea then, this second point, that feeling guides us to a realm of real values, real objective values, is an interesting slant on intuitionism. Max Scheler was the first person to talk of this idea, Brentano and Hartman as well, as mentioned by Schneewind. So this idea is we have this internal feeling that taps into this, not just our own feeling, but this objective realm of values. So it's good within, rather than looking at external facts and factors. So it is intuitive rather than outside. And it runs contrast, so you can describe this as being against any sort of cultural subjectivity, because everyone can tap into this realm. And it does mean that if it's objective, so there is this realm of real values, that we know that some intuitions can be wrong. The question is, whose are wrong? That question leads on to this idea of evidence for this realm is not needed because it's intuition, but how does Max Scheler defend that point? So you could use the point again that intuitionism doesn't have any sort of practical evidence. You can use that to criticize this realm of real values here. It has been argued that this realm of real values, although not by Scheler, that this sense of objective, intuitive good could be God. But does this sense that we have these objective realm of values that we feel, that are moral, that we follow, does this challenge this idea of autonomy? Okay, and the third key point here, in the final paragraph, it talks about G.E. Moore. G.E. Moore has this knowledge of good and bad that we talk about in ethical language, and we've mentioned him quite a few times. He says that they cannot be derived from facts, must come from within ourselves. So, essentially, he says that knowledge of good is like knowledge of the colour yellow. We know yellow when we see it. We can't describe yellow by saying yellow is a banana. Yellow is sunshine. We know these things to be yellow. As to what is yellow, That is the wrong question. Yellow is yellow, and that is the end of it. The same with beauty and friendship. And he says, indeed, the same with morals. So morals are, we know what a moral action is when we see it, but it doesn't make sense to say that morality is helping an old woman cross the road. We know it's moral, so it is our intuition. So what implications does this have? Perhaps it might lead to freedom, empowerment to just do what is right, or perhaps there's an element of social inertia. If we don't know what is right and what is wrong, that is indeed what is right and what is wrong that's shared by society, perhaps we wouldn't really have any confidence in how to act at all. Also, how is social order kept? If I feel something's right and it's against the law, do I act in that way, or do I follow the law? G.E. Moore doesn't address this point. So the question then is, does this idea of G.E. Moore's intuitionism lead to chaos or calm? There's no religion for Moore, and do remember as well, in terms of linking this to facts, that is the 20th century, and it comes from G.E. Moore's very famous work, Principia Ethica. The final point then, to criticise intuitionism, which I'm sure there are plenty of different criticisms to use, to agree, to disagree, and implications of this idea of intuitionism. It offers no way of solving moral disputes. Is this a problem? You can mention the Ian Huntley example again. Whether or not we can say that's good or bad, and if we can, what's the situation here? It doesn't really offer us any method of solving moral disputes. Does the hedonic calculus work any better? We can draw it back to an earlier point about UT. W.D. Ross, as mentioned, does develop on Moore somewhat and says that if we have these self-evident duties to follow, and these duties, these prima facie duties, like duty to act positively towards others, these can form social laws and social order and give us a way of making moral decisions and solving moral disputes that we can all agree upon. This is what W.D. Ross says. The argument then is it any longer intuitionism at all? Make the point, of course, in terms of implications for religion, that it's very, very different to religious teaching. You could argue the point as to whether intuition or religious teaching, which is right and which is wrong, in terms of implications for religion. And you can talk here about perspective, objectivity versus subjectivity, and so on. And that is just to give you a guide of some of the things you can talk about in autonomy and theory, pro and con. Both on UT and on intuitionism, you can bring in lots of examples, strengths and weaknesses that we have studied throughout those two topics previously, lots of linking back to our previous studies, as well as linking to earlier parts of Schneewind, i.e. David Hume, and linking across to other anthologies like Jameson. So continue with your annotations, and we are moving on to the second part in terms of primacy of the community over the individual. Thank you for listening.